This is Alicia Orozco from Transportation for America. Welcome to our Building Healthy and Prosperous Communities webinar. Today we have a great webinar for you. Before we start, I wanted to go ahead and go over a few logistics. We will be answering questions via chat box. The chat box is on your left bottom hand side of your screen. And we will also be we won't be taking questions via phone, but like I said, it will be via chat box. And if we don't get to your question at the end of the presentation, we will definitely have our team of experts emailing you your answers to your questions. To get us started, I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Kevin Thompson. He is our director here at Transportation for America. Kevin?
Thank you, Alicia, and good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those of you on the East Coast and in the middle of the country. For those that don't know Transportation for America, we are an alliance of elected business and civic leaders from around the country that are united to ensure that states and the federal government really step up to invest in smart, homegrown, locally driven transportation solutions like what we're going to be talking about here today. And we've been at this work for starting in January. It will be 10 years. It'll be a 10-year anniversary. Really working at building a robust multimodal transportation network that we know drives economic success in all of our communities. But more importantly, it also helps to elevate the quality of life that we all enjoy as a result of our investments. And an important factor of that quality of life certainly is health. And thanks to the generous support of our funders and our partners at the Centers for Disease Control and the American Public Health Association, we have been able to spend the better part of the last 2 years looking at issues related to planning, funding, and building better walking and bicycling projects in our communities. The report that you're going to hear about today is really a compendium of 8 big steps that should serve as a guide for MPOs and municipalities and others on how to advance mode share for walking and bicycling. Excuse me, lost my place there. How to advance those mode shares. So we're really excited about the work that has been done over the last 2 years, and I want to now introduce our former health program manager, who we just lost as a staff member in the last month, and we've already missed her desperately, and I'm excited to hear her voice on the phone. Rochelle Carpenter, who is going to be our moderator for our discussion today with our 3 guest panelists. So, Rochelle, if you could take it away.
Great. Thank you, Kevin. That was very nice. So hello, everybody. I'm Rochelle Carpenter, and yes, up until recently, I was with Transportation for America for 9 years. I worked on health and transportation issues, among many other things. I didn't go too far. I moved full-time to the Nashville Area MTO and the Greater Nashville Regional Council, and I'm going to continue working on bicycle and pedestrian projects and creative community engagement and policy. And I'm here today to release this exciting guidebook that I wrote with my colleagues at Smart Growth America over the past year that I hope will give you ideas and inspiration to build more walking and bicycling projects in your own regions. I know that MPO staff, all of us have a lot of questions about how to effectively influence what transportation projects are planned and funded and built in our region. And the vast majority of MPOs don't actually build our transportation projects in our regions. So how do we as MPO staff assume a certain amount of control over those transportation projects that are built? What about projects that don't have any federal dollars going into them? Do MPO planners play a role in those projects? How do you work with your board members to embrace new ideas, especially in large and diverse regions where we're grappling with many disparate contexts and people and places? So we profiled 15 metropolitan planning organizations in this guidebook that figured out how to get around those and other obstacles. Each of these MTOs has funded more walking and bicycling projects in their region or projects with better design, like protected bicycle lanes or buffered sidewalks, as we'll hear from Metro and Corpus Christi MPOs today. That was the first criteria that needed to be met in order for an MPO to be featured in this guidebook. They needed to show success in funding more or better walking or bicycling projects. And the guidebook contains these case studies that really do a great job outlining the steps and the context and lessons learned, and very importantly, advice for other MPOs that want to do something similar. So after this, I encourage you to download it. You can ask me if you have questions on the guidebook, and we hope it's really useful in providing ideas and inspiration. So let's see, we got next slide. Can we go back? Well, I'll go to this one. I have control. Here we go. There are 8 chapters of the guidebook that include case studies of MPOs that have had success in each of the categories that you can see here. So we first have design guidance, bicycle pedestrian design guidance, where we feature the MPOs of Portland, Oregon, which is Metro, and Corpus Christi, Texas. So really great at advancing project designs that are going to help people feel more safe and use those facilities more. We also profiled MPOs that are doing great things on complete streets policies and programs coming out of the Columbus area MPO and the Broward MPO, walking and bicycling data collection that we've seen in the Philadelphia region, lots of work on performance measures and how you prioritize walking and bicycling projects. We feature the Bay Area, which is Metropolitan Transportation Commission, the Chattanooga TPO, which is here. And then there are 3 other case studies that you can link to through the guidebook. They're not actually in the guidebook, but you can link to them, and they're available on the website. That's from the Nashville area MPO, the Greensboro MPO. And then we have and SACOG, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments. We also go into the Puget Sound Regional Council, which is out of the Seattle region, and how they've actually dedicated funding specifically for bicycling and walking projects. We profiled 2 MPOs that have great programs getting people to transit stops and other essential destinations with planning and funding coming out of the Atlanta and the Denver regions. We profile the work of the Las Cruces MPO on their creative community engagement and in-depth with community there. And we also did a profile on the Integrated Transportation Health Impact Modeling Tool, which the Nashville area MPO and others have worked on to actually estimate, predict chronic diseases and asthma rates that would change if people were able to walk or bicycle more for transportation purposes. So I'm not going to, let's go to the next slide here. I'm not going to go into detail about those because, as I mentioned, the case studies do have such great detail, but I do want to highlight a few of them. As I mentioned, I do work at the Nashville Area MPO and the Greater Nashville Regional Council. And I know that there's probably some folks on the phone who don't have a key sense of what metropolitan planning organizations do. So I'll just say that one of the main responsibilities of a metropolitan planning organization is deciding which transportation projects will be funded in their region. So MPOs get proposals of hundreds of transportation projects from cities, counties, and others in their region, and they have to decide which of those projects will get funding, specifically federal funding. The way that the Nashville area MPO decides which projects to fund is through a process where we looked at each of the 400 proposed projects that were seeking funding from us a couple years back to determine their potential health impacts. So namely, would the project give people who, a chance to walk or bike more, help reduce air pollution, or help decrease traffic fatalities and crashes? One way that we do that is by giving more points in our scoring process to projects that have a walking or bicycling feature that would serve an area in our region with a higher than average rate of people with a low income, who are unemployed, who don't have a car, and who are over the age of 65. So for every proposed project that we evaluate, can get up to 100 points through our evaluation process, and 11 of those 100 points are reserved for walking or bicycling projects that would serve places with more underserved people, places in red on that screen. Next slide. And so to give you an example, there's this project is showing in a town called Columbia. It actually received several points because it would provide a walking and bicycling path in an area of town with a higher rates of people of color, people with a low income, people who don't own a car, and other demographic characteristics indicative of underserved people. Next slide. I'm really impressed with the work that the Mid-Ohio Regional Planning Commission in the Columbus, Ohio region has done to adopt a regional complete streets policy, because I think they provide a good example of how you can advance bicycling and walking projects throughout a region with urban and rural areas and everything in between. So MORC-C works closely with its board members to design a complete streets policy that was both embraced across the region in the urban, suburban, and rural areas and is effective. In fact, the policy requires that any project receiving funding from the MTO include bicycling or walking features as appropriate to the context of the proposed roadway, of course. If your project is receiving any funding from this MPO, it needs to include safer ways to walk or bicycle, which is really impressive. So read all about how the MPO achieved that in this guidebook. Next slide. The MPO in the Philadelphia region, the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission, runs a really impressive, comprehensive bicycle and pedestrian counting program. For example, they own 15 permanent counters across the region. They also conduct counts over a 7-day time period in 50 locations every year, and they count people who are walking or bicycling before and after certain projects are constructed. They've impressively done 7,000 counts since starting their program and have amassed a lot of data that will help them plan better walking and bicycling projects in the future. So kudos to them, and read all about it in the guidebook. And then my last slide. The Metropolitan Transportation Commission, which is the MPO of the Bay Area, just adopted a regional transportation plan Bay Area, that helps their board members decide which transportation projects to fund, depending on how well they would help the region make progress on these 13 performance measures you see on your screen. So everything from middle wage job creation to climate protection. And as you can see here, their plan actually did help advance their region to meet those goals. They still have work to do on the goals at the bottom of your screen, or the performance measures in the bottom of your screen. So things like access to jobs and the displacement risk of people who are making low incomes and are at risk of displacement. Their plan needs to do better on that. And this, their performance measures system is showing exactly that in a really transparent and accountable way to the public. I really like this program because they have done such a meticulous job with their performance measures, and not only do they choose projects that would help the region meet their goals, importantly, they actually do not fund projects that would have adverse impacts on their goals in a very transparent and accountable way. So that's just a sampling of the kinds of stories that we have in our guidebook. Next slide. I'd like to turn it over to our first speaker, who is Courtney Geary, and she is a senior multimodal transportation planner with the Chattanooga-Hamilton County Transportation Planning Organization, which covers a region in both Tennessee and Georgia. And Courtney is going to walk us through the great work that her TPO has done to score and evaluate and choose transportation projects in a way that elevates walking and bicycling projects. And Courtney?
Thank you so much for the introduction, Rochelle. I'm excited to be on the webinar with you all today and share some of our work with performance measurement and project selection. Next slide, please. The problem we were looking to solve by updating our performance measures and establishing a new project evaluation process was that bicycle, pedestrian, and transit projects received a disproportionately small share of regional funding in our regional transportation plan. Previously, projects were evaluated in silos according to the mode of transportation or type of improvement that they made. So no matter how high-performing a bike, pedestrian, or transit project was, they were left to compete against each other for the little bit of funding that was left over after big-ticket roadway projects were funded. And the project evaluation criteria inherently favored roadway projects that increased roadway capacity and reduced congestion. Next slide. To guide the TPO's work, shifting to a more balanced multimodal system, we surveyed the public and asked, if you had control over the transportation budget, what improvement is most important? The results were fairly evenly split across all types of improvements. So it was clear that the old project selection process, which resulted in about 90% of the funding being awarded to projects intended to address roadway congestion, was not reflecting the community's desire for balanced investment in a multimodal system. Slide. Our solution was to develop the community to region performance framework. And I do have to apologize. It looks like this slide has been a little bit affected, but do check out the webinar, or sorry, do check out the guidebook so that you can see a better image of our community to region performance framework. The framework recognizes that projects at different geographic scales meet distinct needs. For example, projects at the within community scale connect residents to neighborhood serving resources such as schools and grocery stores. Projects at the community to region scale connect people to regional resources such as shopping and employment centers. And projects at the region to region scale connect our TPO area to other regions, both in terms of moving people and freight. The community to region framework allowed us to evaluate projects in terms of how well they serve the goals of each of these geographic scales, rather than the mode of transportation they serve. The framework also allowed us to weight the relative level of importance of each performance measure for each geographic scale, so that all projects don't have to be all things to all people, so to speak. For example, a project's ability to improve freight movement was one of the highest weighted measures at the region to region scale, but was the least significant factor in scoring projects at the within community scale. As a result of this new project evaluation and selection process, funding for bicycle and pedestrian projects doubled. Several transit capacity projects were added to the plan, and transit capital projects were added to the plan, and there was a shift from roadway capacity projects to a fix-it-first approach, doubling funding levels for system preservation and maintenance. Next slide. I believe we'll be discussing some more lessons learned in greater detail, but right off the bat, I'd like to share the importance of starting small and building on existing work with any of you who are considering revising your project evaluation process. You may not be able to evaluate everything you would like to with the level of accuracy you would like to. For example, we were faced with a project of not having sufficient geolocated crash data to work with when we were trying to score projects in the safety measure. But know that you can continue to revise and improve your approach over time, as we are currently, as we're working on the 2045 Regional Transportation Plan update, being able to work with better data, better geolocated data, and having had the time to do cleaning of the bicycle and pedestrian crash data so that we can incorporate in points for those projects to show how they can be addressing these safety issues. So don't let the desire for perfection be the enemy of making a change. I hope this has given you a good introduction to our project evaluation process, and I look forward into diving deeper into the details after the other presenters during our question and answer session.
Thank you, Courtney. Next will be Dan, and he is the Principal Transportation Planner at Metro. Dan?
Well, thank you very much, and good morning and good afternoon. I guess I'll start by recognizing that unlike maybe some of the other parts of the nation, we're pretty fortunate here in Oregon in that we've already had a strong state policy mandate that's directing our urban areas to grow in a controlled and thoughtful manner. We first enacted laws regulating land use in the late 60s and early 70s. So without getting into a detailed history of all that, I simply want to point out that our state land use and transportation planning laws are already requiring compact urban forms that are supported by strong networks of transit and active transportation. So at the regional level, that's really our baseline. That's our starting point for how we develop active transportation design and funding policy. At the regional level, then, our regional transportation plan lays out a series of goals and objectives for how we create that strong multimodal system. And then on top of that, we further refine those regional transportation plan goals and objectives through additional regional guidance, such as the Regional Active Transportation Plan and a Complete Streets Guidebook. These provide further policy and design guidance for the region on how we build our active transportation network. And so, in essence, these two statements here kind of summarize our policies around this. They basically state that the region should be building a dense, well-connected network of active transportation infrastructure that maximizes both safety and comfort for users to ensure that walking and cycling are the preferred choices for shorter trips here in the region. Next slide, please. So this is a bit of detail from the Active Transportation Plan. The Active Transportation Plan really gets into the specifics of what our higher level policy goals and objectives are really meaning. So like I said, this is just one sample of policy direction in the ATP. It provides detail on the appropriate design standards for various classifications of streets and roads throughout the region. And it provides guidance for both the pedestrian and the bicycle networks throughout the region. So we use this policy and planning guidance to inform our regional flexible funds allocation process. We've created several funding categories that we allocate our federal funds through. We have a dedicated active transportation pot. In this last allocation round, we had $26 million dedicated to active transportation projects out of a total of $130 million. Next slide, please. So in the active transportation category, this just gives you one criteria and one application question that really focuses on active transportation and pedestrian and bicycle design elements. So these elements were taken directly from the ATP guidance, so it's pretty clear from the start to the applicants what types of projects we're really going to score well in the process. And the main principle here, again, is to select the highest quality projects that best fit within their neighborhood context. So in accordance with our planning policy, the active transportation design for a low volume neighborhood street doesn't meet the level of mode separation and protection that you would want and need on a higher volume, higher speed arterial. So in essence, a better, safer design scored more points. And this is just one of 10 criteria that we used in selecting projects. Next slide. And then we combined those design standards with additional data to make sure we were investing in the areas of the region that were the most dangerous. So our criteria also focused these investments onto our regional arterial network. Most of these streets were built out to 4 and 5 lanes, in the 60s and 70s, and they carry the bulk of the region's frequent transit service. So what you see on these streets is poor to non-existent pedestrian infrastructure in many, many places, plus higher vehicle speeds. And then you combine that with a lot of people needing to cross those streets or to just stand next to them to access transit. So it's also not coincidentally that these arterials also are serving our most vulnerable and historically underserved populations in the region. So our policy not only focuses our region to invest in good designed projects, but also into areas that have been neglected for decades and are the most dangerous places in the region. Next slide, please. So that's just a kind of a quick overview of how we've translated our design standards and our policy into funding criteria. We think this has served us well. We're still working on this, though. We're currently in the process of updating the regional transportation plan, and a key part of that discussion is really centering on how we can continue to sharpen our focus on making the region safer for people to walk and to bike. One of the big things that we're working on is developing better system performance outcomes relative to these goals and objectives. We've also looked to the MTC for a lot of guidance on that. We've invited Dave Vaughton up here to talk to us. So we're learning from our peers as well, and that will ultimately trickle down into selecting better projects, I think, in years to come. I wanted to also recognize the work that my colleague Lake Stronghart McTighe has done on this. She's our planner who's led the active transportation planning work. She couldn't be with us here today, but she was a major contributor to the guidebook as well. So that's what I have today. I'm looking forward to your questions later on.
Thank you. And next we have Jeff, and he is the Transportation Planning Director from Corpus Christi MTO. Jeff?
Thanks. Hi, good morning, everyone. Thanks so much for the chance to visit with you all. If we want to push on to the next slide. So in 2015, our MPO undertook the first phase of a strategic plan for active mobility focused on bicycle mobility, and we did this largely at the request of the largest municipality in our MPO, the city of Corpus Christi. Historically, debate about where to install bike mobility infrastructure and what form that infrastructure should take had really kind of devolved into pretty divisive discussions at the 11th hour and was undermining the budgets of a number of bond projects. And without a clear prescriptive plan, the city found itself often pulling bike and pedestrian infrastructure out of those projects as an attempt to, last-ditch attempt to balance budgets. And so from the onset, our plan and our planning process was about prescribing exactly what infrastructure should be installed in what parts of the community to ensure a consistent level of safety and access to essential goods and services. So this plan is very much about mobility for the bicycle-dependent commuter or the lay rider. It is decidedly not about recreational use, although we know it does certainly, or the infrastructure will certainly provide some of those benefits. So if we can go to the next slide. This is an overview of a 290-mile bicycle mobility network. What you see in blue are areas in which the bicycle mobility plan prescribes bike infrastructure in association with, but not directly in, the street network. Most of our infrastructure, as you'll see, is actually separated from vehicular traffic. And what you see in gold are areas where we were able to capitalize on off-road connections, namely stormwater easements owned by the city, to provide connections that were entirely separate from the roadway network. But of note here is just the fact that there are no dead ends in this network. We heard early on that from the municipalities in our MPO that ensuring cohesion and connectivity was their priority. So next slide, please. each of the gray cells shown on that overview map corresponds to a detailed map in the plan. The plan is structured like a map book, wherein we actually have a detailed infrastructure prescription for each of the segments in that 290-mile network. Again, the ambition here was to be completely prescriptive to allow for accurate cost estimation at the onset of project development and avoid 11th hour debates about where budgets might be trimmed. Next slide. This table summarizes the classes of key land use destinations that are within a quarter mile of the bike mobility network. So to the extent that the network at its core is about connecting residents of the community to essential goods and services, this is sort of the validation of the network. What you see on the left are the 6 classes of key destinations in the community that we use to shape the network. And happy to answer any questions about the detailed GIS methodology if anyone has them. But in essence, we overlaid GIS layers of the individual destinations in each of these categories to identify hotspots of community activity. And the network was shaped using network analysts in GIS around those key destinations. And so what you see on the right are the percentage of each of the individual destinations in those categories that are within about a 5-minute walk of the bike mobility network. So in almost every category, the network services over 80% of the destinations in that particular category, with a particular focus on schools and grocery stores and food sources. Next slide. Also happy to talk a bit more about this in question and answer if anyone's interested, but as part of our plan development, we developed a few novel modes of collecting stakeholder input, including a customized map interface that allows users on any device to identify routes that they would like to ride if conditions were improved. And we also partnered with Strava to capture data from riders of all types in the community. Next slide. Of the 290-mile network, about 140 miles prescribes separate, protected one-way cycle tracks like that which you see here. This is actually a rendering of a street that is currently under construction as part of a bond project in the city of Corpus Christi. The decision to pull bike infrastructure out of the street and behind the curb was based on a couple things. The city engineering department determined that in cases where there's currently an on-street bike lane, which is built as a full pavement section to support vehicles, in cases where such a roadway came under reconstruction and that 5 feet on either side was reallocated as a concrete cycle track, the city stood to save about $500,000 a mile during roadway reconstruction because of the cost difference in constructing what is essentially a second concrete sidewalk versus 5 feet of extra pavement width on each side of the road. And then there's recurring savings during roadway maintenance. So that, coupled with the obvious benefit in terms of level of service and safety to lay riders, really pushed us to pull a full half of the infrastructure out of the roadway and again and prescribe it in the form of these one-way cycle tracks. So we've got about 7 miles of these under construction now, another 5 or so miles in design, and the idea is that we'll continue to chip away to the tune of 4 to 7 miles every 2 years as the city undertakes bond-funded roadway projects. Next slide, please.
Thank you,
right.
everyone.
Thanks.
Now we're going to go ahead and we're going to proceed with questions. And Rochelle will start it off with a Q&A. Just anyone that's online, remember, if you have any questions, please provide your questions via chat box. And like I said, if we can't get to your questions today, we'll definitely have our experts get back to you some other time or as soon as the webinar is over. Rochelle?
Great. And Jeff, was there a concluding thought you wanted to make sure to make before we move on to Q&A?
I think in essence what's unique about this planning process is that we were as prescriptive as possible. We really endeavored to eliminate any potential for uncertainty as to what infrastructure should be installed where. So sort of the mantra of our planning process was really the right infrastructure in the right places. So we have historically installed on-street bike lanes by default in this community, and the ambition was really to uphold a standard level of safety, and doing so requires being very thoughtful about what infrastructure you put on what classes of roadway, and I think that was really the hallmark of this planning effort overall. Thanks.
Great. There are a number of questions coming in, so thank you, everybody. A lot of them are technical questions. Some of them can actually be answered in the guidebook itself. So after this, please check out the written case study of examples like the Corpus Christi MTO Bicycle Mobility Network. Should be able to answer some of your questions, such as I saw one that came in asking how Corpus Christi MTO used the GIS network analyst to determine the bike network. We cover that question in the guidebook itself, as well as some others. So please definitely check that out, and we'll try to answer as many of these questions as possible. To kick things off, we know that so MPOs are governed by boards of directors. Boards of directors are typically made up of elected officials throughout our regions, and they come up with policies and they sign off on policies, and their support for the things that we do is key. So my first question to you, and we'll go in the order that people talked, presented their case study. Just briefly, what was one important thing that you did that led to the support of your board for the particular initiative that you accomplished?
For the Chattanooga TPO area, it was really about having a data-driven approach that reflected community preferences, community goals, and priorities. Our leadership team, our board members, the public, our technical and community committees were with us at every step of the process. They had the opportunity to weigh different values against each other for each of the scales when we were trying to determine how to weight the different performance measures for each geographic scale. They were with us when they were setting the priorities and saw how that resulted in the scoring of the projects. So it became very hard to argue with the data when they saw how we had reflected those community preferences in the scoring.
Great. Dan, the most important thing that you did?
Yeah, I would say here in the Portland region, probably the most important thing we did in the adoption of our active transportation plan was to not mandate one single design standard for the entire region. We have varying levels of support and enthusiasm for active transportation infrastructure around the region. Some cities, such as Portland and Milwaukee and Tigard, for example, embrace it to a pretty high extent. There are other communities that, they see different needs and priorities, and active transportation is one of many things that they feel are important. So we didn't want to take a you must build your active transportation infrastructure this way type of approach, but we rather wanted to say, well, this is the industry standard, this is the most preferred, the safest, the best way to build it, and then to emphasize that through our regional funding processes to illustrate that this is what we want to spend our regional funding on, how we want to build this transportation network possible. So I think we found that sweet spot in there of balance between local community needs and wants and desires and regional policy and goals and objectives.
Great. Yeah, it's really important. And Jeff?
Yeah, actually what Courtney said really resonated. In our case, emphasizing from the onset that how our analytical process and how data-driven it was to be, and be clear that there was no advocacy in this effort in the sense that where data didn't bear out investment, we would not prescribe infrastructure. And so I think there was a degree of there was an attempt to sort of build some street cred in that respect. And then secondarily, we worked very hard from the onset to give credit to our local elected officials, to our board, frankly, even when there had been very little attention paid at that point by some of the folks on the board to this effort. I think it's once you've publicly given credit to elected officials for great work in the community, it's very difficult for them to be detractors of that work. And so that's a strategy that we've employed from the onset, and to the extent that we as a region have gotten some positive attention regionally and beyond, that has worked well for us in maintaining some positive momentum.
Awesome. And second question for the three of you, what is one piece of advice that you have for other MPOs that want to or may want to do something similar in their own region? So a lesson learned or a piece of advice that you could pass on to other MPOs. Courtney?
Another lesson learned I'd like to share is to be prepared for the staff time that is going to take to do your project evaluation. If you do decide to take a more data-driven approach that's going to involve more performance measures, it's doable, but you might want to give yourself more time than you expect. As an example from our experience, we had about 150 projects to evaluate, and that took about 120 consultant hours and 10 additional TPO staff time hours, which doesn't include the time that it took to run the travel demand model and run an off-model calculator for the projects that couldn't be evaluated using the travel demand model. So that was about 30 to 45 minutes per project for evaluation.
Great.
Yeah, and this is Dan. I think one big takeaway from our funding allocation process was how critical it is to work with your project applicants on their project design as they're preparing their projects for submission. We spent a lot of time helping our partners around the region to tweak their designs or make adjustments or changes that would both help them fit within our available funding level, as well as make the project design just work better. So I think it's important to have that kind of capacity and ability to help your regional partners with their project development work.
Great. And Jeff?
I think in our case, we've learned the hard way that you can never really rest when it comes to rallying public support for active mobility infrastructure, especially in communities where such infrastructure is still considered by many to be an expendable amenity. We, I think, at some point assumed that we had a critical mass of momentum, and we focused on the technical planning work. And I think when we picked our head up from that, we were surprised to find that we had lost some ground politically and had to kind of, go back to the well of public support to reinvigorate that political momentum, and I think that was a hard lesson learned for us.
Okay. Thank you. So as I said, we have a number of questions. Most of them are specific to the project that was discussed by each of these staff. So we'll try to go with some of the bigger picture questions and see if we can answer some of the more detailed questions offline. The first question is directed at Jeff, but also it rolls into a question for all presenters. So the question is, what did you hear from the public, from their response to pulling bike lanes off of the road? Was there pushback in that kind of design, that separated design? So that's for Jeff. And then to the other presenters, Dan and Courtney, what are strategies for actually locating bike lanes in your cities that the MPO has some participation in the discussion over?
Okay, that's actually a great question and speaks to the nuance of and the importance of a plan that explicitly addresses different classes of cyclists. So we were very clear from the onset that this planning process was about mobility. It was about connecting the everyday rider to key destinations. And what we heard unambiguously from the everyday rider, 72% of respondents said they do not feel comfortable with any sort of proximity to vehicular traffic. And that's a function of an aggressive driving culture here and a very neophyte cycling culture. But the mandate was clear to create as much separation as possible. What we did hear from when we visited with what I'll call the sports cyclists, spandex wearing, Saturday morning, distance-oriented cyclists, of which, in full disclosure, I am one. And so having access to that community was reasonable, and to the honest opinions of that community. What we heard from that community is there was some concern that creating off-street infrastructure would send mixed messages to the community about where it was acceptable to see cyclists, recognizing that sports cyclists, road bikers will never ride on a protected cycle track unless it's a Monday morning and they're commuting to work. So we included in the whole back half of our plan is a matrix of best practice recommendations related to policy and programming and enforcement. And we included some pretty detailed recommendations about the inclusion of signage that says that cyclists may use the full lane, or cyclists may use roadway, basically to indicate that just because a cycle track exists, there is no expectation that all classes of cyclists will necessarily use it. Likewise, we included a separate map book that identified priority sport routes around the community. And we included a recommendation to the municipalities that when they build cycle tracks, protected cycle tracks off the street, on a corridor that is known to be a priority road bike corridor, they may also consider leaving a wider shoulder, even if not a striped on-street bike lane, to accommodate cyclists in the streets. So in other words, basically there's some explicit recognition that different classes of cyclists have different needs, and there's going to have to be a community engagement and education process to make sure that the average driver understands that the presence of a cycle track, it does not translate to the requirement that all cyclists use that cycle track.
Great. Yeah, the Corpus Christi MTO did a really great job engaging people and getting their preferences through a variety of methods, and just did a fantastic job with the community engagement. So definitely check out their story in the guidebook. Courtney and Dan, do you have anything to say about how the MPO helps facilitate discussions and help make decisions about bike lane placement?
Sure.
Yeah, I'll jump in on that. When we put our regional active transportation plan together, we spent months on actually developing the specific network that includes specific streets with projects, that need to be done to bring the network up to full completion. The network shows where there are gaps or substandard infrastructure for the actual type of street. Our guidance says we should be having protected facilities on all of our major arterials, but in a lot of those we just have standard 5 or 6 foot in-road bike lanes. So we spent a lot of time getting the public's input on what the network should look like first, and then what specific streets we really ought to be improving to bring them up to active transportation standards. And the main reason we did that, and the guidebook touches on this, but we have research now that's been done by the city of Portland, but this holds up throughout the whole region, is that about 60% of the population here says we want to ride our bikes, either for, throwing on the Lycra and going out on a, ride on your lightweight racing bike, or just, hopping on your cruiser bike and going down to the farmer's market on Saturday morning. But, people like the ability to ride their bikes, but our existing infrastructure throughout the region still does not make a big portion of our population feel safe doing that. And I think it's important to note that somewhere around 90% of the households in the region have a bicycle. So people have bikes. It's incumbent upon us to build better and safer infrastructure to actually get them to use them.
And then from the Chattanooga perspective, for our 2040 plan, in preparation for that, we did an update to our regional bicycle and pedestrian plan, and half of the facilities that were recommended or half of the network that was recommended in that plan was funded through a set-aside in the regional transportation plan. The plan also included a gap analysis looking at where there's high demand for bicycle activity, but there's currently a lack of infrastructure, and looked at access to health-related destinations, how projects could improve access by biking to those health-related destinations such as schools and grocery stores and doctor's offices. For our 2045 regional transportation plan update that we're working on now, we've since been able to incorporate a level of traffic stress analysis into that gap analysis, just as both of our other presenters were talking about. We wanted to think about that interested and concerned group of cyclists, the people who aren't biking now but would like to, and how can we create a bike network that's going to serve them. So we've been able to adapt research showing what type of facility would be needed based on the number of travel lanes, based on the posted speed of traffic, and say in some cases where we might have a bike lane on a road now, although that looks like it's part of our bike network, it may not be enough. It may not be enough protection from traffic for someone to really feel comfortable on that. So thinking about how a more protected type of facility could be a project that would be prioritized through the plan to complete that network gap. We've also been able to do a transportation disadvantaged analysis to identify facilities that would serve those traditionally disadvantaged people, as well as look at our bicycle crash data to see where we have disproportionately severe crashes and may be in need of better infrastructure.
Awesome. That's great. Thank you, Courtney. So one more question that I'll ask to the group, a bigger picture one. But I also just want to say there's a few questions that I think are coming in, assuming that some of the infrastructure in Corpus Christi has been built. And I just want to let everybody know that these are still plans. Infrastructure hasn't been built yet, but some of the projects have actually been funded.
There is quite a bit of infrastructure under construction in Corpus Christi actually right now.
Under construction?
So we do have some cycle tracks that are under construction and some bicycle boulevards that are under design and will be designated. So some of the off-road facilities have been built, bicycle boulevards and cycle tracks are under construction.
Awesome. Okay. So last question, just to two of you, because I think we have to wrap up shortly. How do you keep your board supportive of this work when the board turns over every year and doesn't feel that the work done was accomplished with them and that isn't necessarily aligning with their own views? Jeff, I've heard you talk about this specifically. I think, the prescriptive nature of the initiative, helps address this question. So I'd like to ask you to take that first, and then either Courtney or Dan, and then we'll close out.
Sure, thanks. This has been an ongoing challenge for us, not just on our board, but on city council and the municipalities within our MPO. And our number one strategy there is to continue to keep positive news and positive press in front of them and to give them sort of in aggregate as elected officials credit for their foresight, vision, and all of the great recognition. So, even if we have council or board members who don't necessarily feel invested historically because much of the work was done before they were on the scene, we continue to give public credit for foresight and support of the ongoing initiatives, and in that way, try to box out and preclude the conversation of, this was policy undertaken before I was on the scene, and therefore I'm going to take a scorched earth approach to it. So we try to get ahead of that essentially by giving credit even where it may not be due.
Yeah, that's a great point. Positive media coverage. That's an awesome thing to take away. Just really quickly, Dan or Courtney, do you want to take that question? How do you keep your board supportive when there's so much turnover?
We have a lot of people that have been with us since the start. So Dan, I don't know if you'd rather take that?
Well, I was going to say we don't have a big churn on our MPO board either, and in general there has been a lot of historical support for active transportation here in the region. We also have a very strong network of community organizations and advocates that really keep the pressure on them to continue funding active transportation. And our elected Metro Council has 3 seats on our MPO board, so they also hold that position that we need to be continually investing in our active transportation network.
Absolutely. Advocates are key to all of this. So yeah, thank you for ending with that. Alicia, I'll turn it over to you for the last slide, I believe.
Actually, it'll be me, Rochelle. Thank you so much, Rochelle. It's great to just see all of this come to fruition. Great work on this. And thank you, Jeff and Dan and Courtney, for sharing so much of what you all have done in your own communities with colleagues across the country. I think the exchange is really beneficial. I just want to leave people with 2 parting pieces of information. One, T4A, or Transportation for America, we're generally known as T4A, is a membership-based organization. We do have quite a few MPOs, municipalities, and other governmental units that are members of T4A. A lot of them choose membership in our organization because they want to remain on the leading edge of what's happening in the world of transportation planning and policy. So this is a great forum for that, and if you want to talk about what those benefits might be for your organization, please reach out to me. My email is there. And secondly, we also do quite a bit of technical assistance work with MPOs. In particular, I think right now we are working with 6 different MPOs across the country on a broad range of issues related to project selection, criteria, decision-making processes and performance measures for access to opportunity, equity, health and active transportation, resilience, carbon emission reductions, creative placemaking, and other issues. So if you are interested in learning a little more about technical assistance for your own organization, a lot of them do start out with just a simple workshop. On the last slide there is contact information for Erica Young, who can talk to you about that, and we're happy to follow up. Thank you, everybody, for being a part of the conversation today. The entire guidebook is now up online at T4A, so you can go to our website at www.t4america.org, and you'll be able to see that. Everyone, have a great day.